I am often mistaken for a very famous German sociologist, as well as a Formula One racing driver. Um, so, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm here with a degree of nostalgia and humility. Nostalgia in the sense that the discussant on the panel is my former PhD supervisor, and also the first conference paper I ever gave as a budding academic was at St Anthony's College, probably in 1987 or 1988. I gave a paper on Soviet policy in Africa, and the discussant was one Michael McFall, who then I think was on a Fulbright here doing a DPhil, went on to become the American ambassador in Moscow and gave me a right grilling. We talked about trauma this morning, and that was a pretty traumatic experience. I hope today you're going to be a lot more gentle than he was, although he came up after actually, and he did apologize. But anyway, you know, the great and the good have come through this place, and it's great to be here. So I am going to talk about NATO in the main, and in a way it parallels Henrik's presentation. He talks about the European Union and Ukraine. Mine has a similar set of themes in some ways, but the focus is institutionally somewhat different. And I am going to make I guess if there's an argument here, it's that a little bit of history and a little bit of political science assist in the way in which one might interpret what is going on in Ukraine in its relationship with external actors, in my case, with NATO, and one step removed, therefore, with the United States and the individual allies. So there'll be a little bit of historical context. There'll be brief introduction of a couple of political science concepts, which to many in the room will be fairly familiar. The idea of the security dilemma, and also the idea of signaling and deterrence, which we covered all too briefly this morning in the discussion on Taiwan. And in some senses, this is where these comments come from. I've spent the last year writing an article on failed deterrence in Western policy towards Ukraine up to 2022. And I finally got that off the desk on Tuesday. And yeah, it was quite a struggle. But some of the reflections follow from my work on that. And many of you may be familiar with the notions of signaling and sunk costs and tied hands and all that sort of stuff. And I won't go into that in detail, but it is quite interesting. And you know, if you want, you can question me on that in the Q&A, the poll side behind some of this. And I'm making these comments, of course, under the shadow of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, and the big debate going on in NATO at the moment around defense expenditure and its relationship with Ukraine. And my recourse to history and political science is to try and move away from the drama and the headlines around the transatlantic relationship and the relationship between Ukraine and NATO, because the headlines, although of course interesting, and there's some wonderful journalism and some wonderful podcasts on NATO and Ukraine at the moment, you know, they're doing a different job from the one I'm employed to do as a jobbing academic. So I'm going to give you a bit more context, which will lead to a somewhat different set of conclusions than those which one would draw if one only read the headlines about the end of the world under Trump and Vance. I don't think it is the end of the world, bottom line up front. I think NATO will do what it's successfully done for the last 75 years plus, which is to absorb transatlantic turbulence, and it will continue to do a reasonably good, not perfect job in the provision of European security and a continuation of the transatlantic link. And I'm aware simply saying that opens it up to a certain lines of questioning and runs against the mainstream view that the sky is falling in because of the current administration in Washington. Okay, so some historical background. Then I'm going to just pause to outline a few comments on where the transatlantic relationship stands now. Then a few words on the United States and NATO under Trump 2, the United States and Ukraine under Trump 2. Then answer two questions: what then for NATO? What then for Ukraine? And then a conclusion. And just to recall, my exam question was NATO's Eastern orientation with or without the United States. So that's the broad theme I'm going to tackle. And I will end up by saying the United States will remain with NATO, but it is going through a very significant process of incremental withdrawal, and where that will take us at this point is not clear, but it is not going to lead to a catastrophic and abrupt American withdrawal. So that view is in part informed by a sense of the history of NATO, and 75 years and counting. It's an organization of long standing. It's an alliance which has confounded many times predictions of its demise. A few things that are worth bearing in mind in that 80-year history. So if we go back to the Cold War, one should recall two things that are significant in the way we understand the transatlantic relationship today. One, the United States was to some degree always a reluctant member of the alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed in 1949. It required a considerable debate in Congress. The Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the famous Article 5, required the Vandenberg Resolution and months of debate in Congress to arrive at a wording which was sufficiently qualified that the United States would not automatically be dragged into the defense of its West European allies. There is no automaticity in the North Atlantic Treaty, and that's worth bearing in mind, because Article 5 is often misunderstood as having this almost theological significance in the transatlantic relationship, that the United States is completely committed to European defense. The treaty does not provide that level of automaticity. First point. The second point is that once the United States did commit to the North Atlantic Treaty and thereafter to NATO, NATO's development was determined by American leadership and European followership. So a number of consequences follow from that. The American presence in Europe was significant, of course, extended nuclear and conventional deterrence. 460,000 American service personnel were in Europe in the late 40s, early 50s. Remember, after World War I, the Americans went home. They did not go home after victory in World War II. Even in the 60s and 70s, there were still 300,000 Americans in West Germany, Italy, Turkey, the United Kingdom, etc. The military leadership of NATO was headed by an American, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the first incumbent, General Eisenhower. Every single incumbent thereafter and to this day has been an American. Allied to that was followership by Europe. You've probably heard the expression, this was empire by invitation, not imposition. The Europeans, the French and the British, West Germans, the Dutch, the Danes, the Norwegians, all traumatized by the Second World War, needed some sort of protection, which they were not able to provide themselves, and the Americans were persuaded to stay, particularly by the Attlee government, which was probably the most significant moving force in the North Atlantic Treaty. That meant, however, a hollowing out, an emptiness in Europe's self-sufficiency in defence. There were one or two failed attempts to create a non-NATO European force, the Pleven Plan, the Western European Union, but none of them survived. The only credible option, but one that failed, was that of de Gaulle and French semi-detachment from NATO. Other options did exist, of course, neutrality, and of course Roy wrote a very good book on this, so it's very important we should remember that neutrality to some degree was an option in the Cold War. But the idea of European defence autonomy outside of NATO was a non-starter once NATO got up and running. The so-called myth of the European pillar in NATO never came to realisation. That then created a particular dynamic within NATO which survives to this day. On the one hand, as a positive, the idea of a transatlantic bargain. The Americans would provide conventional and nuclear deterrence in Western Europe, and actually in Southern Europe. Let's not forget Turkey, which was the site of the birth of the Truman Doctrine. The United States would provide deterrence, but in return, the Europeans would look after their own economic and political integration, and hence the European Steel and Coal Community, the European Economic Community, and what became the EU. And not forgetting Lend-Lease. It should be remembered the British didn't pay off Lend-Lease until, I think, the Gordon Brown government in about 2009. So this was not necessarily an act of generosity on the part of the United States. So the transatlantic bargain was important. It meant an ongoing logic of burden sharing, but also burden shifting, the collective action problem of having many allies together, but the weaker allies shifting the burden onto the stronger, the United States most obviously, but also to some degree the United Kingdom, which over-provided security in Europe. The British Army on the Rhine being the manifestation of that from the point of view of the British. And the birth and the ongoing development of the so-called alliance security dilemma, conjured up by Glenn Snyder in an important article in 1984, the dilemma between entrapment and abandonment. What does the key ally do if it is leading an alliance which is costly to itself and from which there is no obvious clear security benefit to the homeland? Does it abandon, defect, or does it go along, i.e. it remains entrapped in some way? And that dilemma continues to this day. So the Cold War, even though many people look back at this now as a sort of golden age of transatlantic harmony and clarity and grand strategy, was always one of some difficulty. The key issue for today is the fact that NATO, not surprisingly, it's almost a banality to say it, was an American-led organization. But what is often forgotten in that is it meant, in effect, an abandonment, a form of learnt helplessness on the part of Europeans, who effectively gave over their strategic autonomy to Washington. Briefly, that continued when the Cold War came to an end, all the way up, arguably, to where we are today. The United States remained the key ally in NATO, even though there was a big debate at the end of the Cold War on possible alternatives, including a proper defense union within the European Union. But the United States was the key ally. The NATO would not have intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo if not for the United States. ISAF would not have been established in Afghanistan if not for the United States. And ISAF would not have been withdrawn from Afghanistan if not for the United States. The United States, throughout that period, was also key to the ongoing extended nuclear deterrent under NATO, and a not insignificant number of troops on the ground. There were about 80 to 100,000 at any one time up to this day. in Europe on various missions, many of which are related to NATO. So that's some necessary historical background before we start thinking about the Trump administration. So where are we now? Some headlines and then a little bit more detail. We are in a position of transatlantic turbulence, but the inference you may draw from what I've said so far is there's nothing new in that. Is the Trump administration somehow qualitatively different from other NATO skeptics, such as Richard Nixon and the second George Bush, both of whom commissioned classified studies on how the United States could execute a withdrawal from the alliance. NATO, secondly, has a very firm Eastern orientation, of course. That's a return to the Cold War. Out of area operations are out. NATO, of course, is no longer in Afghanistan. It no longer pretends to have a global mission where it would deploy. It has partnerships in the Asia Pacific. It has a training mission in Iraq, but it is now completely, I think, beyond the realms of possibility that NATO would ever again undertake the sort of mission it did in Afghanistan. NATO still has a southern strategy, but it doesn't really deploy many resources to that. NATO's focus is to its east. 8 battle groups from the Baltics all the way down to Bulgaria are the main mission of NATO. That, of course, comes on top and is reflective of a NATO-Russia schism, part of a global great power competition in which a fractured global West faces off Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and so on. And that, of course, is a somewhat crude simplification, but that is, if you like, the undergraduate essay I set my students: to what degree is NATO reflective of this new world of global competition? And in many ways, that is the easiest way to understand it. And underneath that, and of significance for probably all of us in this room, wherever we pay our taxes, a revival of a contemporary guns versus butter debate, or as I think is probably better labeled in this country, a guns versus international aid debate, as NATO, under thrall of the Trump administration, commits to higher levels of defense expenditure. What does that mean for the tax-raising powers and the welfare priorities of governments? And I'll come to that in the end as part of my conclusions. Okay, so that's where we are. So then a few comments then on the Trump administration specifically in that light. Of course, the headlines here we all know, many of which actually come more from the first Trump administration than the second. Trump's rather brutal and blunt remarks on NATO about the alliance being obsolete and the United States being willing to withdraw from the alliance. Most of those actually come from the first administration. The comments of the second administration and during last year's campaign, Trump was very outspoken on defense expenditure, but you probably look in vain for any comment of Trump or his administration that the United States is ready to withdraw from the alliance. So unlike the American withdrawal from the World Health Organization or the Paris Agreement on climate change, the United States has not taken any steps or even indeed hinted that it is ready to withdraw from NATO. And that's worth bearing in mind because the headlines often give you the other story. Indicative of what I think is the more accurate position, Secretary of Defense Hegseth at the Shangri-La Dialogue 3 or 4 days ago, speech in Singapore, all about the Asia Pacific. But there is a paragraph on NATO which is important. He said, "We still believe that the N in NATO stands for the North Atlantic, and that our European allies should maximize their comparative advantage on the continent. So two things. The N stands for the North Atlantic, so no NATO in the Asia Pacific. The allies should utilize their defense resources for where they have comparative advantage, which is in the defense and security of their own backyard. Quite important, because remember, if you go back to 21 and 23, the United Kingdom's defense reviews, it was all about the tilt to the Asia Pacific on the assumption that this is what the United States wanted. It wanted allies in the region. Hegseth's message is no, thank you. We can do that, thanks very much, if we need to, with the Australians or the Japanese or the South Koreans. We don't need Canada, Germany, France, or the United Kingdom. France, by the way, may object because it does regard itself as a Pacific power. But the idea that this is NATO's purpose is not the position of the Trump administration. Second, from Hegseth's speech, and actually a link to one of our speakers this morning, is the need to restore deterrence. Hegseth and the Trump administration argue that deterrence failed in 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine because the Biden administration and NATO more generally signaled weakness when it came to Ukraine. Thirdly, Hegseth singles out what he refers to as model allies. Not surprisingly, that includes Israel and Saudi Arabia, but it also includes Poland, the Baltic states, and wait for it, Germany. So Germany, which had been in the crosshairs of American criticism for many years for not spending enough, is now seen as a model ally because, of course, Friedrich Merz is making all these big spending commitments. And then lastly, in a phrase that Obama or Biden could have made, we will remain loyal to our allies and we will rely on the key strategic advantage of a network of allies in Europe and the Asia Pacific. Now, words are only words to some degree, but that is a considerable change of tone and content from what Trump was saying in his campaign. So let's wait for the first national security strategy of the Trump administration. If it reflects those sorts of sentiments, then I think one could argue that Trump is not hell-bent on withdrawing from NATO after all. You can see this also in the physical commitment to NATO. The United States is fully engaged in NATO's 2025 and 2026 exercise program, European Defender 25, which is going on as we speak up in the near Arctic. The Americans are part of that. This is what used to be called Reforger exercises, where tens of thousands of Americans would come across the Atlantic for the defense of Western and Northern Europe. And also to watch the NATO summit in 2 weeks' time. The agenda for that is being worked out as we speak. There was a meeting of defense ministers yesterday. This very much reflects the American agenda, not just to increase defense expenditure, but to repurpose capability plans among allies for European defense. The renewal of Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which is due in the summer, will be an American. Initial reports were that Trump would hand that over to a European. Not true. That will be the head of the American Air Force. So all of this suggests an ongoing commitment. Where, however, there is clearly a shift from the Biden administration is Ukraine. And the headlines here, to some degree, obviously reflect reality in a way that's probably different from the discord between headlines and reality in NATO. Trump has clearly departed from the policy of the Biden administration. There have been no presidential sequestration of funds for Ukraine since Trump arrived. The National Defense Authorization Act going through Congress at the moment does not have a headline item for Ukraine. Trump has engaged in direct talks with Russia, something the Biden administration refused to do. He has broken the Western consensus on war guilt, blaming Ukraine as much as Moscow for the commencement of the war. He has sought a reset of relations with Russia, and there appears to be some sort of grand strategic element that all of this is part and parcel of a sort of reverse Kissinger breaking Russia off from its relationship with China in order to focus on what the United States regards as the main threat, which is China. So that's where we are at present. So what then for NATO? What then for Ukraine? And here I am being a somewhat more speculative. These are questions, if you like, without any obvious answer. So what for NATO in light of that background? So two scenarios, there are many, but these are two ends of the spectrum. One is the sort of pessimistic view, and I use a phrase that was whispered in my ear last week. I was in Brussels all of last week, that the NATO, the alliance, and indeed the headquarters is a house of cards. At any point, the whole thing could come tumbling down. This would occur if Trump turns up at the Hague summit, has a hissy fit, doesn't like the fact that the allies are not spending enough on defense, and walks into the chamber of the North Atlantic Council and says, right, we're out. This was a fear in 2018 when, if you believe John Bolton, Trump was persuaded against doing this in the motorcade between his hotel and the summit chamber. It's possible. Personally, I think it's very unlikely. If you look at the atmospherics of Trump's meetings with Macron, Starmer, Merz, and also Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, all key NATO allies, it's all been fairly jolly, as distinct from his meeting with Cyril Ramaphosa and Volodymyr Zelensky. I think Trump is fairly on side with NATO, and the big American demand to come up with a pathway to spending 5% of GDP on defense, however that's carved up, NATO is going to, that will be in the communique. I think we can assume that with some confidence at this point. So I don't believe that NATO is on the edge of a precipice, but it's clearly going through change. And so the other scenario, which I think is more likely, is a Europeanization of NATO, if you will, almost by coercion, because the United States will simply, by increments, withdraw its commitments rather than in one fell swoop. And it can do this in a number of ways. It can start to withdraw people from the NATO command structure. There are about 2,000 Americans in the NATO command structure at the moment, including the SACO, which I've mentioned, the heads of 3 operational commands, etc., all the way down. The United States could simply stop sending people, and the Europeans would have to cough up. Even that, though, at the moment, it's not happening. The new chair, the chief of staff of the chair of the NATO Military Committee, who started his job just last Monday, is American. So there is this path dependency, or is this just the Americans remain committed? However, that would be one step. The United States withdraws from the NATO command structure and from the NATO force structure, so it stops aligning its military to NATO. This is the process of NATO defense planning. And it could stop giving it a degree of political attention. So the choice of personnel who go to the permanent delegation in NATO HQ, the American permanent delegation in NATO HQ is 4 times the size of the second largest, which is Germany. The Americans could start passing all that down, etc., etc. And this would require the Europeans to step up. And personally, I think the British already realize that this is a possibility. For the British, this is an opportunity. Equally, it is for Germany, France, and indeed Poland, Finland, etc. Now, the transition to that could be very bumpy, and the destination is unknown. And at the moment, the Europeans would not be able to substitute for the political and strategic role the Americans play. Remember my phrase, strategic learned helplessness. There is a lack of culture among even France, Germany, the UK, who like to think they have global strategies. There is a lack of strategic culture about how to lead the alliance. So there is something of a gap there. What then for Ukraine? So just headlines. Ukraine will not join NATO anytime soon, probably not ever, in my opinion. Whether that's good or bad, I do have a view on that. I won't say it now. But as a fact, I don't think it's going to happen. I can't see there will ever be a consensus in NATO for Ukrainian membership. Equally, there will be no NATO force in Ukraine anytime soon, or indeed after any form of ceasefire. There will be no KFOR, S4 or ISAF in Ukraine. There won't even be a NATO training mission Iraq type arrangement either, because the Ukrainians will say, well, we actually don't need training in country. We are pretty competent and capable of fighting a war without the advice of key allies. What we will have, however, are forms of unique and enhanced partnerships, and of course the ongoing supply of arms. And there are lots of questions around all of this. How will the war end? Will the country be permanently partitioned? Will Russia reconstitute its military capabilities? Who comes after Zelensky? And so on. So a lot of speculation, but messy, I think, would be the one-word description. Okay, so to conclude, a couple of points to bear in mind here. I'm going in a slightly different direction to that I've been traveling so far, but it is these are some thoughts worth bearing in mind. First, this war will end at some point. It may seem a very difficult thought process at the present to imagine how, but it will end. All wars end eventually. How it will end is not clear, but it will. And post-war thinking is important. And the parallel here with the Cold War. Now, I realize the Cold War, of course, was not a hot one, but its ending was imagined throughout the 1970s. The Helsinki process, the CSCE, the high-level summatory nuclear negotiations, the NBFR talks on conventional force reductions, etc. Unfortunately, none of that is going on at the moment, and it can't, because the nature of the Russian-European, Russian-US relationship is so bad. But post-war thinking within the so-called West is pretty absent at the moment. How Ukraine will fit in whatever European security architecture emerges, and how, and this is more controversial, the relationship with Russia can be repaired. It may seem unimaginable at the moment, but it seemed unimaginable in the 50s and 60s and early 70s as well, as détente came and went, and we entered the Second Cold War under Andropov and all the rest of it. At some point, that relationship will have to be repaired. And then the second and linked is, to repair it requires an awareness of where we are. And where we are, to use a phrase of Charles Glazer, this comes from an article in Foreign Affairs about a year ago, we are currently living in a security dilemma. I'm not sure policymakers are necessarily aware of that fact. So a security dilemma, i.e. taking measures to ostensibly increase our security by spending more on defense, etc., forward positioning troops, makes us more insecure because reciprocal measures are taken by the other side. The great insight of the end of the Cold War was that Gorbachev, Reagan, Helmut Kohl, Margaret Thatcher, and others realized they were living in a security dilemma and took measures to alleviate it. And in so doing, GDP expenditure on defence, we blanch now at going up to 3% in this country. Back then, we were spending 5 or 6%. The only way to overcome a permanent entrenchment of militarized thinking and an absence of dialogue is to be aware that this is a dilemma from which great power politics has to in some way escape. And on that rather enigmatic note, I'll leave it there. Thank you.